Hi everyone, my name is Josue and I'm going to share with you my illustrations today. The first one I'd like to share is a personal illustration, and just to give you a bit of context, I'm pulling this illustration and associating it with the passage in 1 Samuel chapter 25, the story of David and Nabal and his wife Abigail. David is asking Nabal for some compensation. He had just done some work for Nabal, and Nabal is refusing to pay David. And so in his anger, David responds, in his anger to Nabal, and his wife Abigail wisely diffuses the situation. Now, here's my illustration for all of this. Have you ever responded in a situation like that with a hot head? I think it's happened to me maybe once in my life. No, I'm just kidding. It's happened a couple times in my life, and it typically, unfortunately, happens when I'm behind the wheel, when I'm driving. I get goaded on by someone. Either I'm being tailgated, someone just comes flying by, and they get really close to the car. It just really bugs, and it makes me want to ever so gently test my brakes whenever whenever they do stuff like that. But like we discussed earlier, or we were talking about earlier with Nabal and David here, foolish people can make us respond in really, really foolish ways. And no, I'm not proud of that I've responded in ways that way. But thankfully, just as foolish people can make us respond in foolish ways, wise people in our lives can also help us facilitate things in our lives that help us respond in a wise way. So I certainly thank God for a very wise woman in my life. And this was the exact sentiment of David towards the wisdom of Abigail. This was Nabal's wife. In 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 32, David says to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you to me today. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me." Listen to what he says, "keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands." Suddenly, David is aware of what he was doing, how one moment of impatience could have ruined his life. That wise woman I was telling you about in my life is my wife. She has done this very same thing for me time and time again and again while I'm driving down the road. Someone starts to tailgate me and I start to get really impatient and I start to grab the wheel just a little bit tighter, and she can see my shoulders tighten up and I'm just starting to get there. And as soon as she sees my impatience, she walks up to me. She puts her hand on my shoulder and she says to me, "Pastor Josue, are we being nice?" And it's like, all this steam comes flying out of my ears because I feel like such a hothead. I'm just losing my patience so bad. And while I don't share in David's remarks or grateful remarks as immediately as he does towards Abigail, I eventually get there and I just pull over and let the person go by. I truly am thankful for my wife and how she saves me from several really bad situations. But she's there really on God's behalf to harness my impatience and wisely diffuse my impatience. The next illustration I'd like to share with you is my biblical illustration. In the book of Judges, we're introduced to the physically the most strongest person to have ever walked this earth. His name was Samson. And despite his strength, he was just no match for the lure of his temptations. Time and time again in that passage, we read how he would break or bend his commitments to his Nazirite vow. And in one of these instances, we're given just the absolute best illustration for sin. Now, just to give you a bit of context here, Samson visited the city of Timnah where he saw this beautiful woman. He wanted to marry her. He went back home, told his parents, "Hey, I want to marry this girl." So they all go back down to Timnah. And on their way there, they're attacked by a lion. And Samson kills this lion with his bare hands. Now, Scripture tells us in Judges chapter 14, verse 8 and 9, it says, sometime later, this was after they'd already gone down to meet this young lady. They'd all gone home. Now Samson is again going back to Timnah. Sometime later, when he went back to marry her, he turned aside, and look what it says, to look at the lion's carcass. In it, he saw a swarm of bees and some honey, which he scooped out with his hands and ate some as he went along. Now, isn't that exactly how sin works? It lures us in. It entices us. It somehow, at the end of it all, once we've given in to that temptation, it doesn't even always feel wrong. That's what sin does. It's designed to, Samson must have been thinking, man, that honey looks so good, and I got something beneficial from it, right? That's kind of what sin does. But again, let's look at that image. honey clothed in a dead animal. What an incredibly accurate picture of temptation. Sure, it's sweet, but it will kill you. We need to open our eyes to the lures of sin and the bait of temptation and all the hooks that they've got out there. I promise you, they've got many of them. We've all got more than one temptation, but we need to not surrender to sin so easily as Samson did. Because despite his strength, while Samson was strong and while he had his eyes, he was blinded. He was blinded by his temptations. It was only after he had his eyes gouged out that he had clear vision from God and finally used his strength for God's glory. Next illustration is the fresh from the press illustration I'd like to share with you. Fox News released an article a couple weeks ago titled like this. It says, Pastor Robert Jeffries, Biden is president-elect. How should Christians respond? What is God doing in this outcome? And why would he allow this to happen? Now, what caught my eye when I saw that article, that headline, was the last line of the header. Was this pastor actually trying to answer why God allowed this to happen? Was he claiming to know the mind of God? That's what caught my eye on that headline. And just on a side note, personally, I struggle a little bit. I may be wrong in this, I'm not sure. But I struggle a little bit with pastors who try to tell their congregations, or the public for that matter, how they should vote. I do believe, however, it is a pastor's job, 100% a pastor's job, to tell you what the Bible says about governments and rulers and kingdoms and so forth. Now, I was pleasantly surprised when I actually read through the article. Because that's not, in fact, what this pastor was doing. He was not actually telling you what God was thinking. He wasn't claiming to know the mind of God. So I felt a little more at ease as I started reading through that. He in fact goes back to cite Daniel chapter 2, verse 21, saying, "It is God who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings." So his statement was designed to give the reader hope in incredibly uncertain times, give them hope regardless of how they voted. He would go on to say, the fact that God has established authorities means that by obeying the government, listen to this, he says, by obeying the government, we are obeying God. Now, I'd encourage each and every one of you as well, all of you, with Jeffrey's words, his closing words in his article, he says, when Joe Biden becomes president, we should commend him for the things he does right. We should condemn the things he does wrong. And above all, we must pray fervently for our president. If President Biden succeeds, we all succeed. May God bless Joe Biden, and may God bless the United States of America. I want to be very clear, this illustration is in no way a political statement. I just want to make that clear. But however you voted, however you feel after this election, whether you feel happy, whether you feel sad, find hope in knowing that nothing that has taken place has changed God's plan, and he is still solely in control. Next illustration I'd like to share with you is someone else's illustration. This is an illustration from the senior pastor at my church. His name is Dane. Now, personal responsibility is vital in life, and it should always begin at a young age. It should be being taught at even a young age. And this Pastor Dane, he once shared a story during a sermon of how he was teaching his son responsibility, financial responsibility for that matter. And so they went to the store, and his son Landon brought a toy to him and said, "Oh, Dad, can you buy me this toy? You know, I don't have my money on me, but if you pay for it now, when we get home, can I give you that money?" And so Dane says, "Yeah, sure, of course, no problem." So he goes, he buys the toy for him, and when they get home, he asks, of course, Landon for the money. And Landon sort of shyfully says, "You know what, I'm sorry, I thought I had the money, but it turns out I don't." So he turns to Landon, Dane turns to Landon and tells him, "I'm going to teach you a new word today. It's called repossession." And so he goes and he takes the toy and puts it away, and until Landon collected enough money and was able to pay for it, he gave him the toy back. Now, in the same manner, I believe this is exactly what God does when he teaches us some very uncomfortable and often hard lessons, but it's always for our good. We don't see that. We only see a small piece of the puzzle. Just like Landon, all he was focused on was on that toy and in the moment. But God, and Dane representing God here, was trying to teach a larger lesson. It's not just about the single moment. It's about the greater financial responsibility that you need to learn. And so God teaches us some of those hard lessons sometimes. And we need to often keep that in mind as we continue through some of the difficulties in life. All right? And I believe this is my last illustration. It's a pop culture illustration. Not sure if you folks heard about it, but just a couple weeks ago prior to the election, Lil Wayne met with President Trump. And what a wonderful privilege to be able to just call up the White House and say, hey, Donald, I'm coming over, right? That's exactly what that seemed like, to be able to meet with the president. But there's a beauty in our relationship that we have with Christ because we have something so much higher yet. We have a relationship higher with Christ, with God, the creator of the universe, than any celebrity will have with even the president of the United States here on earth. And better yet, I don't have to call up and ask for an appointment. I can freely and confidently just go right up and talk to God. I'm allowed to just pray and be in the very presence of God. I'm allowed to come and sit in church and just be in the presence of God. I'm allowed to meet with my friends and family and be in the presence of God. The sacrifice of Christ has given us the freedom to boldly and confidently come before the throne of God in heaven. And I thank God so much for that I don't have to call up the White House and be like, hey, I'm coming over. Thanks so much, guys.